You can run. But this time, there's nowhere left to hide. The palace walls, once thought impenetrable, are cracking. Secrets buried beneath decades of protocol, privilege, and carefully curated public images are finally clawing their way into the light. What if everything you thought you knew about the royal family, about loyalty, about power, was a lie? Imagine being in the eye of a storm so intense that it doesn't just shake the monarchy, it threatens to topple it completely. That's exactly where we begin. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. It starts with whispers, a casual comment in a crowded room, easily dismissed, yet heavy with implication. People talk, and when you pay close enough attention, even the most offhand remark can reveal a hidden truth. Have you ever wondered what truly happens behind the gilded doors of palaces, the kind of events that are never meant for public eyes? Tonight, we step across that invisible line. Tonight, the invisible becomes visible, the whispers become a roar. Consider this, an investigative journalist, relentless, uncompromising, one who has made a career out of exposing uncomfortable truths, once said that power is the ultimate amplifier of secrecy. And when secrecy meets desire, when hidden alliances form in shadowed corridors, the consequences can be explosive. That journalist, let's call him Tom Barron, spent years piecing together a web of clandestine meetings, late-night rendezvous, and carefully hidden documents. And in this story, what he uncovered would challenge the very perception of loyalty, morality, and the public image of the people we thought we knew. Now, let's pause for a moment. You may be thinking, why does this matter to me? Why does the secret life of a royal family intrigue millions across the globe? It's simple. These are the people who shape public policy, who influence culture, whose decisions ripple far beyond the palace gates. When their private actions contradict their public persona, when they act with impunity while the world cheers them on, the implications are massive. And that is exactly why this story matters. Because this isn't just gossip. This is a study in power, influence, and the dark undercurrents that flow beneath even the most polished surfaces. The first clue came in the form of letters, carefully coded, meticulously hidden in envelopes that appeared mundane to the untrained eye. They spoke in half-truths, in illusions that required years of contextual knowledge to interpret. Barron, with his sharp eye for nuance, immediately sensed the gravity of what lay before him. Have you ever held a letter that changed the way you saw the world? One that whispered a secret so startling it made you question everything? That was the feeling he had, holding those letters in the dim light of a London flat, the hum of traffic below punctuating the silence. And then there were the photographs. Not the glossy images you see in magazines, perfectly lit and carefully staged. These were the moments captured by chance, a glance, a gesture, a fleeting touch that hinted at something deeper, something forbidden. Every photo told a story, and every story pointed in the same shocking direction. Imagine seeing evidence that challenges everything you thought you knew about someone. That sense of disbelief, that edge-of-your-seat tension, is exactly what Barron experienced, and it's exactly what will grip you as we unfold this tale. But let's slow down. We are not here merely to shock. There's a method to the madness, a structure in the chaos. First, we explore the setting, the palaces, the secret rooms, the labyrinth of power. Second, we dive into the key players, their ambitions, their insecurities, their hidden motives. And third, we trace the series of events that transformed private desires into public crises. Each step builds upon the last, a carefully constructed domino effect leading toward revelations so unsettling that the consequences ripple far beyond the palace walls. Have you ever wondered why certain people always seem untouchable? Why, despite repeated scandals or whispers of misconduct, they continue to hold power, influence, and prestige? The answer often lies in the intersections of wealth, loyalty, and secrecy. When Barron began connecting the dots, he realized he was not merely uncovering isolated incidents. He was revealing a system, a network of interdependent relationships where silence was currency, complicity a tool, and betrayal a weapon. The very foundations of what the public perceived as stability were, in truth, fragile and porous. And here is the most unsettling part. While the public narrative is carefully curated, smiles and photographs, charitable appearances, elegant speeches. The private story is raw, messy, and deeply human. Desires collide with responsibilities. Ambitions clash with morality. And in those collisions, lives are reshaped, reputations shattered, and history rewritten. The allure of power has a price, and it is often paid in secrecy, in manipulation, and in the quiet devastation of those caught in the crossfire. You might ask yourself, who benefits from keeping these truths hidden? Who stands to lose the most if they see the light of day? That question drove Barron deeper into hidden archives, encrypted messages, and confidential interviews. Every answer raised new questions. Every revelation hinted at a larger story yet untold. What we are about to explore is not merely a scandal. It is a mirror reflecting the darker impulses of human nature itself: vanity, desire, greed, and the lengths we go to preserve the masks we wear. And yet, even in this darkness, there is drama, tension, and, strangely, moments of dark humor. The palace, despite its grandeur and gravitas, is a place where human folly is magnified. Imagine a world where etiquette and appearances are weapons, where small slips of behavior carry consequences far greater than the perpetrators could ever imagine. Imagine the irony, the contradictions, the unexpected twists of fate. In this story, nothing is as it seems, and every assumption is ripe for challenge. We begin with a question. What happens when two powerful individuals, both accustomed to command and control, find themselves drawn together in secret, their actions invisible to the public eye but inevitable in their consequences? What lengths would they go to protect their reputations? How far could ambition and desire override judgment, loyalty, and morality? These are not rhetorical questions. They are the very threads from which this intricate tapestry of scandal is woven. And so, our journey begins. The initial discovery was minor, a hint, almost negligible in isolation. But as Barron followed the trail, that minor hint grew into a series of interconnected events, each more astonishing than the last. Meetings in shadowed corridors, whispered conversations at gala events, coded letters hidden within legitimate correspondence, each element a piece of a puzzle that few dared to imagine. And as the pieces fell into place, the picture that emerged was both breathtaking and terrifying. The stakes could not have been higher. Public perception, family honor, personal ambition, all teetered on a knife's edge. One misstep, one leak, and everything would unravel. Barron knew this, and so did the players he observed. Every glance carried weight. Every gesture could mislead or reveal. The tension was electric, and the consequences monumental. By the time the first major revelation surfaced, the ripple effects were already underway. Allies became enemies, loyalties shifted in whispers, and the palace itself seemed to breathe with anticipation and dread. Behind closed doors, decisions were being made that would shape the future, not just of the individuals involved, but of the monarchy as a whole. And the public, blissfully unaware, continued to consume carefully curated narratives, oblivious to the storm gathering just beyond the curtain. Now, here's the twist. Nothing in this story is straightforward. There are no heroes or villains in the conventional sense. There are only humans navigating the treacherous waters of power, desire, and secrecy. The decisions they make are influenced by a complex web of emotion, ambition, and circumstance. And it is precisely this complexity that makes the story so compelling, so addictive, so impossible to look away from. So what comes next? How does a single discovery escalate into a full-blown crisis that shakes the monarchy to its core? How do hidden alliances, secret rendezvous, and carefully guarded letters converge to produce consequences that ripple across society? That is what we will explore in the chapters ahead. Each one will pull you deeper into the labyrinth, revealing new secrets, new betrayals, and new twists that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew. And here is the final question for this introduction. If power can corrupt so thoroughly, if desire can override duty, and if secrecy can conceal so much, what hope is there for truth? What hope is there for justice? What hope is there for anyone caught in the crossfire of those who control the narrative? But what comes next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. It started with a whisper, a casual remark in a room filled with gilded chandeliers, polished floors, and the echo of carefully rehearsed etiquette. No one paid it much attention at the time, but Tom Barron did. He had learned, over decades of investigative work, that the smallest comment often hid the largest truths. And this one hinted at something extraordinary, something dangerous, something no one in the palace wanted the public, or anyone else, to know. The palace itself was a fortress, both in stone and in tradition. Its walls had witnessed centuries of history, yet even these walls could not contain the secrets of the present. Hidden passages, long corridors with doors that led nowhere but into silence, and private rooms that seemed ordinary to the casual visitor. These were the places where power played out in ways the public could never imagine. Barron walked these corridors in his mind, piecing together the invisible map of influence, hierarchy, and clandestine encounters. Who could have guessed that behind the polished silver and velvet drapes, human desire and ambition ran unchecked? Who could have imagined that the very people portrayed as paragons of dignity and decorum were as flawed, impulsive, and unpredictable as anyone else? These weren't the tidy scandals whispered in tabloids. These were events that could rewrite reputations, alter alliances, and shake the foundations of centuries-old institutions. Barron's first clue came in the form of an intercepted message. A line of text that seemed innocuous to the casual observer but, upon closer inspection, revealed an intimate knowledge of someone's movements, someone's preferences, someone's hidden patterns. He read it again and again, each time uncovering a subtle nuance, a coded signal, a hint of secrecy that had been carefully embedded. And as he did, the weight of what he was discovering pressed down on him. This was more than gossip. This was a revelation. Have you ever noticed how power magnifies every action? A smile, a glance, a simple touch. Within the palace, these gestures carried meaning far beyond their appearance. Barron had seen it before in other high-profile investigations, but never with such intensity. The interplay of authority, desire, and secrecy created a tension so palpable it was almost a living thing, a force pressing against the very fabric of reality. And for those who misstepped, the consequences were swift and often devastating. To understand what was happening, Barron had to know the players intimately, not just their public personas, the faces that smiled from portraits and waved from balconies, but the private individuals behind the carefully curated images. Ambition, vanity, loyalty, and fear all intertwined in a complicated dance. Every relationship was a potential source of revelation. Every secret alliance a thread that, if pulled, could unravel a web far larger than anyone suspected. And then there was the first meeting, the one that would begin a chain reaction of events no one could have predicted. It was unremarkable at first glance, a discreet gathering in a private salon, attended by two individuals whose influence rivaled entire governments. But in the subtle gestures, the choice of words, and the timing of glances, Barron recognized a story waiting to be told. The tension in the room was almost tangible. Each participant knew they were being watched, even if indirectly. Each knew the stakes, and each had something to hide. This chapter of discovery wasn't straightforward. It required patience, intuition, and the willingness to sit in silence while the pieces slowly revealed themselves. Barron's process was meticulous: observe, record, verify, and connect. He had learned the hard way that jumping to conclusions could ruin an investigation. Every detail mattered, no matter how minor it seemed at first. A gesture here, a phrase there, a slight hesitation, it all contributed to the larger narrative. Barron began to reconstruct the timeline. The meetings, the travels, the private conversations, everything pointed toward a pattern. It was a pattern of secrecy, desire, and calculated risk. The palace, once a symbol of tradition and stability, was instead a theater of hidden dramas, each more intricate than the last. Barron documented it all, knowing that each new discovery would raise the stakes and, inevitably, the danger. And the danger was real. Secrets like these rarely remain contained. Once a truth is exposed, it can cascade, sweeping aside careers, reputations, and alliances in its wake. Barron knew that he was treading on delicate ground, and yet he could not stop. He was compelled by the story itself, the irresistible pull of hidden truths that demanded illumination. It was during one of these late-night reviews of documents and photographs that he noticed the first real inconsistency. A series of dates didn't align with publicly reported events. A few seemingly minor absences had been deliberately obscured, rewritten in official records to conceal movements and meetings. Barron's pulse quickened. If these were deliberate manipulations, what else might be hidden? And what would be revealed if the public ever discovered the full truth? Here's where the story takes a darker turn. Barron realized he was not just documenting facts. He was uncovering a system designed to conceal its own operations. Each layer of secrecy built upon the next, creating an intricate web that few could penetrate. And the deeper he went, the more he understood the stakes. This was no ordinary scandal. This was a revelation that could shake the very structure of the palace hierarchy. Have you ever been on the verge of discovering something so explosive that it changes the way you see the world? That was where Barron found himself. Every new detail added weight, and yet also created questions. How had these arrangements persisted unnoticed for so long? Who had been complicit? And most importantly, what were the consequences if this information became public? The palace itself seemed to respond to Barron's intrusion. Security tightened, official statements became more carefully worded, and small, seemingly insignificant events began to take on new meaning. Every action was a clue, every reaction a signal. The tension mounted, a pressure building not just for Barron, but for the entire network of individuals whose lives he was scrutinizing. And then came the first photograph. A fleeting moment captured by chance, a glance, a gesture, something intimate yet subtle. To anyone else, it would have seemed meaningless. To Barron, it was confirmation, a tangible piece of evidence that hinted at relationships, alliances, and decisions hidden from the public eye. The photograph raised more questions than it answered, but that, in itself, was enough to propel the investigation forward. Every investigative journalist knows the thrill of discovery, the adrenaline, the tension, the anticipation of what comes next. Barron felt all of this and more. The palace, with its rituals and expectations, became a stage for a drama that was as human as it was shocking. And as he pieced together the events of that first critical encounter, he realized that the story he was uncovering would not just fascinate the public. It would challenge their understanding of loyalty, power, and morality. By the end of that initial investigation, the scope of what Barron had discovered was staggering. Relationships once thought stable were revealed as fragile. Alliances previously assumed trustworthy were fractured, and the careful facades maintained for decades began to crumble. And yet, the most shocking revelations were still ahead. Every palace secret has a moment when it chooses to step into the light. Every hidden alliance, every forbidden gesture, every private decision eventually finds a way to surface. And as Barron prepared for the next phase of his investigation, he understood that the consequences would be far-reaching, not just for the individuals involved, but for everyone who believed they understood the palace and the people within it. The question lingered. If power could create such hidden complexities, such secretive behaviors, what else was being concealed? And what would happen when the public finally glimpsed the truth? But what came next would change everything. And no one saw it coming. The palace, grand and imposing, always had a way of making its occupants feel simultaneously omnipotent and trapped. Tom Barron had learned that the walls themselves held memory, echoes of whispered conversations, footsteps that carried hidden intent, and doors that shielded both secrets and sins. It was in this labyrinth of marble floors and gilded ceilings that Barron began to see patterns, invisible to most, but painfully clear to someone trained to observe the nuances of power. The first major breakthrough came not from a document or a photograph, but from a conversation overheard in the most unlikely of places, a private tea room behind the official kitchens. A staff member, exhausted and distracted, let slip a remark about a meeting that should never have happened. It was brief, offhand, almost casual, but to Barron, it was a thread he could not ignore. In investigative work, such fleeting mentions were often more valuable than months of surveillance. They were the cracks in the facade. Barron pursued the thread relentlessly. Every day, he retraced steps, revisited past encounters, and reviewed archives that had been meticulously maintained to appear mundane. But even the most innocuous details sometimes revealed startling truths. Who dined with whom? Who lingered too long in a corridor? Who sent letters at odd hours? These small deviations from routine carried meaning. And as the patterns became clearer, the scope of the story began to expand far beyond anything Baron had initially imagined. It was during this stage that he realized how elaborate the palace's mechanisms of secrecy truly were. Protocol was not merely a set of rules for appearance. It was a shield, a tool, a carefully calibrated system that allowed certain behaviors to remain hidden while maintaining the illusion of perfection. Guards, aides, and even distant relatives were all pieces in a chess game whose rules were only partially understood. Each had a role to play, and each misstep could unravel the delicate balance that kept the public narrative intact. Every investigative journalist knows the duality of these discoveries, exhilaration mixed with apprehension. The thrill of uncovering hidden truths is tempered by the knowledge that exposure can have ramifications far beyond the office or the newsroom. Baron felt this tension acutely, knowing that the palace was not just a place of history but a living organism, capable of adapting, manipulating, and concealing in ways that few outsiders could anticipate. And then came the first direct confrontation, a subtle one, orchestrated in such a way that it seemed accidental, almost benign. A message left where it would inevitably be seen, a meeting arranged under the guise of casual discussion, a warning couched in polite language. Baron realized, in that moment, that his investigation had begun to attract attention. The palace was aware that someone was peeling back the layers, and it was preparing its response. What was remarkable, though, was the resilience of the secrecy network. Even under scrutiny, the players adapted with incredible finesse. Baron found that every attempt to uncover one truth only revealed another, each more convoluted than the last. The palace was not merely a building. It was a living maze, designed to protect the privileged, mislead the curious, and conceal the human desires that could never be fully tamed. Have you ever wondered how far someone will go to protect a secret? Baron's investigation provided the answer, nearly to the point of obsession. Alliances shifted overnight. Confidences were tested. Every step required careful calculation. Every move carried weight. And all the while, the tension mounted, like a slow-burning fuse ready to ignite. By the end of that first month of deep investigation, Baron had amassed enough information to sketch a preliminary map of the palace's hidden networks. Meetings, messages, and gestures all pointed to a core truth. Beneath the polished exterior, a complex web of human desire, ambition, and secrecy controlled the narrative of power. The revelations were staggering, and Baron understood that the story he was building could redefine public perception, and not necessarily in a way the palace would approve. And yet, despite the meticulous planning and the careful concealment, one misstep remained inevitable. In systems as intricate as these, there is always a point at which tension becomes critical, when the balance can no longer hold. Baron had reached that point without even realizing it. Every clue he uncovered, every pattern he identified, brought him closer to a confrontation that no one could anticipate. As the chapter closed, a single message arrived on Baron's desk. It was cryptic, brief, and untraceable, an ominous warning that hinted at consequences, danger, and revelation. Baron understood instantly that the next phase of his investigation would be the most perilous yet. The palace, it seemed, was watching, and it was preparing to respond in ways that would test not only his resolve but the very limits of the secrets he sought to expose. What would happen when the first domino fell? How would the palace react when carefully constructed facades began to crumble? And most importantly, who would be caught in the crossfire when hidden alliances were revealed? But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. It started with a single slip, a minor miscalculation, almost invisible in the grand machinery of the palace. But in a world where every gesture is observed, every word is weighed, and every glance carries hidden meaning, even the smallest error can ignite a firestorm. Tom Baron had been following the threads of secrecy for months, connecting letters, meetings, and photographs into a coherent narrative. And now, the first true scandal was about to surface, one that would ripple far beyond the gilded walls and polished floors of the palace. The palace staff, usually impeccably trained to maintain composure and discretion, had begun to show cracks under pressure. Whispers of unusual gatherings, unexplained absences, and last-minute changes in schedules were circulating, almost imperceptibly, among those closest to power. Barron had learned long ago that human behavior rarely lies. Even when words are carefully chosen, the body, the timing, and the inconsistencies reveal truth. And in this case, the clues were unmistakable. It was during a late-night review of documents that Barron found it, a chain of correspondence that contradicted every official record. Meetings reported as routine social engagements were, in fact, carefully orchestrated encounters between two highly influential figures within the palace. What made this particularly explosive was the intimacy suggested by the notes, the subtle allusions that hinted at a relationship that had never been intended for public scrutiny. The implications were staggering. Have you ever seen a house of cards begin to wobble? That was the sensation Barron experienced as he pieced together the first undeniable proof of a hidden connection. Each document, each photograph, and each carefully coded phrase stacked atop the next, forming a narrative impossible to ignore. The tension was palpable. The more he uncovered, the higher the stakes became, not just for the palace's public image, but for the individuals involved. This was no ordinary secret. It was a revelation that threatened to destabilize relationships, alliances, and public perception. Barron had expected to find discrepancies, minor irregularities, perhaps the occasional hidden favor. But the magnitude of what he was uncovering exceeded even his most vivid expectations. Every carefully constructed public persona, every polished statement, every meticulously choreographed appearance was suddenly cast in a new, darker light. And the timing couldn't have been more critical. The monarchy, like any institution rooted in tradition and public trust, thrives on perception. Even the hint of scandal can erode confidence, stir gossip, and ignite media speculation. Barron understood this, and he also knew that releasing such information would be like setting off a chain reaction in a powder keg. Every action would provoke a reaction, and those reactions could be unpredictable, explosive, and far-reaching. Barron traced the scandal back to the first indiscretion, a seemingly minor encounter carefully concealed under layers of protocol and appearances. It was almost innocent, a fleeting moment between two people, yet it carried a weight that would have far-reaching consequences. How often do we underestimate the power of small actions, the way minor secrets can accumulate until they become irrepressible forces? Barron had learned that in high-stakes environments, no detail is too small, no action too trivial. The investigation required not only evidence, but context. Barron spent hours interviewing aides, deciphering coded communications, and analyzing patterns of behavior. Each new piece of information revealed a complex web of relationships, loyalties, and ambitions that intersected in ways that were both fascinating and terrifying. The palace was not merely a residence. It was a living organism, with its own rules, hierarchies, and imperatives. And the first scandal, once revealed, would test those rules in ways few could imagine. But it wasn't just the discovery itself that was shocking. It was the subtle indications of complicity. Some individuals were not merely passive observers. They were active participants, shaping events behind the scenes, manipulating information, and guiding outcomes to their own advantage. Barron recognized the signs immediately. The patterns of behavior, the hidden signals, the orchestrated timing, all pointed to deliberate coordination. This was a scandal not born of chance, but of intention. Barron also noticed the human element. Power and secrecy often breed a peculiar mixture of fear, arrogance, and desire. The individuals involved were acutely aware of the risks, yet their ambitions, impulses, and needs drove them to act regardless. This combination of calculated risk and human vulnerability created a volatile situation, one that could unravel in spectacular fashion at any moment. And Barron was watching, ready to document every twist, every nuance, every moment of tension. As the first scandal began to emerge in his investigation, the palace's defensive mechanisms also kicked into high gear. Aides were repositioned, meetings were rescheduled, and subtle measures were taken to control perception. Barron observed these maneuvers with a journalist's keen eye. Every action was a signal, every precaution a clue. The more carefully the palace sought to conceal, the more transparent the hidden tensions became. One of the most fascinating aspects of this unfolding drama was the psychological dimension. Secrecy has a way of distorting perception, of magnifying both paranoia and desire. Barron watched as individuals navigated a world in which every word could be scrutinized, every gesture interpreted, and every choice could alter the balance of power. The palace, in all its splendor, became a stage for a psychological drama as compelling as it was dangerous. And then came the evidence that would confirm the first scandal beyond any doubt. A photograph, previously dismissed as ordinary, captured a fleeting moment that, when placed in context with Barron's other findings, became undeniable proof of the hidden connection. The image was subtle but revealing, a glance, a touch, a positioning that betrayed intimacy. To anyone else, it might have seemed inconsequential, but to Barron, it was a keystone in the story he had been building. Every new revelation compounded the pressure. The palace, always a symbol of dignity and control, was suddenly revealed to be a theater of human complexity, ambition, and hidden desire. Barron documented it all meticulously, knowing that the implications extended far beyond the palace gates. The public narrative of stability and decorum was being challenged, and those inside the palace understood that exposure could alter the balance of power permanently. Have you ever wondered how people respond when their carefully constructed facades are threatened? The initial reactions were subtle: cautious language, slight changes in routine, heightened awareness. But Barron knew that the tipping point was near. Secrets, once exposed, have a tendency to escalate. What begins as a minor scandal can quickly metastasize into a crisis that engulfs everyone connected. And the first scandal Barron had uncovered was precisely at that juncture. The psychological toll on those involved was evident. Even individuals accustomed to scrutiny exhibited signs of stress: guarded interactions, terse statements, and sudden absences. Barron recognized the patterns immediately. The palace, as resilient as it appeared, was beginning to strain under the weight of hidden truths. And once the first domino fell, it was clear that nothing could prevent the chain reaction that would inevitably follow. And then, in the midst of it all, a curious anomaly emerged. A message, seemingly benign and innocuous, contained a subtle threat, an indication that someone within the palace had become aware of Barron's investigation. It was a warning, a carefully crafted signal meant to intimidate, to control, and to assert influence. Barron's pulse quickened as he read the words. The palace was no longer merely the subject of his investigation. It was an active player, aware, reactive, and dangerous. The first scandal had officially arrived. What had begun as whispers, hints, and small anomalies had coalesced into a narrative impossible to ignore. Barron understood the gravity of the situation. The consequences would not be limited to reputations alone. Power dynamics, personal relationships, and institutional stability were all at stake. And once the story reached the public, the reverberations would be felt across society. But just as the first pieces of the scandal fell into place, another discovery surfaced, one that threatened to overshadow everything else. A hidden meeting, previously unknown, had taken place at the very heart of the palace. Its implications were staggering, suggesting a level of coordination and intent that far exceeded the first scandal. And with this revelation, the story took a darker, more dangerous turn. The palace, with all its grandeur and tradition, had secrets that were waiting to be uncovered. And Barron, relentless and uncompromising, was on the trail. Every document, every photograph, every whispered remark was a key to unlocking truths that no one wanted revealed. But what he found next would escalate the story beyond anything imagined, and put him directly in the path of those desperate to keep their secrets hidden. What was that meeting about? Who orchestrated it? And what consequences would follow? And more importantly, what lengths would those in power go to in order to protect themselves when the scandal could no longer be contained? But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. The palace, magnificent and imposing, often gave the illusion of order and stability. But as Tom Barron had learned over countless investigations, appearances are almost always deceiving. Beneath the glittering chandeliers, polished floors, and impeccable decorum, a web of hidden alliances pulsed like an unseen current. Every gesture, every whispered word, every seemingly insignificant encounter was part of a network designed to protect some and manipulate others. And Barron was beginning to trace its intricate lines. It started subtly. Barron noticed certain aides lingering longer than necessary in hallways. Certain courtiers attended events they had no business at. Even the pattern of seating at formal dinners appeared to follow rules that defied official explanations. At first glance, these details seemed trivial, perhaps coincidental. But in Barron's experienced eyes, they were pieces of a larger puzzle, signals of alliances that had been quietly forming in the shadows. Have you ever wondered how power really functions in closed systems? It's not just about titles, privileges, or public perception. It's about influence, control, and mutual advantage. And the deeper Barron delved, the clearer it became that these hidden alliances were not merely social. They were strategic. They provided protection, leverage, and access to information that would otherwise remain out of reach. In essence, they were the invisible scaffolding that held the palace's hierarchy together. Barron's breakthrough came from a seemingly minor observation. Two senior figures, previously believed to operate independently, were consistently present in the same locations at the same times. Their interactions, subtle yet deliberate, suggested a degree of coordination that went beyond friendship or coincidence. Every shared glance, every carefully timed word, seemed to reinforce the idea that they were acting in concert, manipulating events behind the scenes while the public narrative portrayed a very different story. The implications were enormous. If these alliances existed, and Barron had every reason to believe they did, they could explain a host of previously inexplicable events. Unexpected absences, sudden reversals of policy, and the concealment of scandals that had long been whispered but never substantiated. What appeared chaotic to outsiders was, in fact, a carefully orchestrated system of influence, designed to protect certain interests while exploiting vulnerabilities elsewhere. Barron began documenting these interactions meticulously. Every movement was logged, every conversation noted, every minor gesture scrutinized. He cross-referenced observations with previously obtained letters, photographs, and coded communications. Slowly, a picture began to emerge, a lattice of loyalty, ambition, and calculated risk, in which every participant understood their role and the consequences of deviation. And yet, there was an element of unpredictability. Human behavior is rarely entirely rational, and even the most carefully constructed alliances are vulnerable to personal ambition, jealousy, and desire. Barron noticed subtle tensions within the networks. Small disagreements that could have been dismissed as trivial began to accumulate, creating fissures that might eventually split alliances apart. These fissures were small, almost imperceptible, but to someone trained to see the patterns, they were glaringly obvious. Have you ever noticed how quickly secrets unravel when ambition interferes with loyalty? Barron observed that dynamic in real time. Even the most cautious players sometimes took risks that exposed them to scrutiny, whether by accident or by design. And in such a high-stakes environment, a single miscalculation could have catastrophic consequences, not just for individuals, but for the delicate network of power they relied upon. The palace itself seemed to respond to these tensions. Security protocols shifted subtly, communications became more encrypted, and staff behavior grew increasingly defensive. Barron recognized the signs immediately. The hidden alliances were aware, at some level, that someone was uncovering their connections. And as the pressure mounted, the likelihood of exposure and subsequent fallout grew exponentially. It was in the midst of this delicate balance that Barron uncovered a series of clandestine meetings. Not in obvious locations, but in hidden rooms, secluded gardens, and private salons. The participants moved with caution, aware that any misstep could compromise the entire network. Yet despite their vigilance, small errors left traces, the timing of departures, overlapping schedules, and subtle inconsistencies in statements. Each detail added to the growing mosaic of secrecy. Barron also noticed the subtle role of intermediaries. Individuals who acted as bridges between factions, conveying messages, mediating disputes, and smoothing over potential conflicts. These intermediaries were often underestimated, but in reality, they were crucial to the maintenance of the alliances. They ensured that information flowed, loyalty was reinforced, and risk was minimized. And their presence underscored the complexity of the palace's inner workings. This was not a simple hierarchy, but a dynamic system of interdependent relationships. And then came the first major conflict. Two factions within the palace, each representing different interests and ambitions, came into direct opposition. It began with a minor disagreement over protocol, escalated through subtle maneuvers and strategic communications, and culminated in a confrontation that exposed not just tensions, but deep-seated rivalries. Beren watched as the players navigated this conflict with a mixture of skill, cunning, and raw emotion. The alliances were being tested in real time, and cracks were beginning to appear. Have you ever seen a carefully constructed system begin to collapse from within? Beren had a front-row seat. The hidden alliances that had seemed so stable were suddenly vulnerable. Subtle betrayals, miscommunications, and unanticipated reactions created a cascade effect. Relationships that had been carefully nurtured for years were strained to the breaking point. And the palace, for all its grandeur, seemed suddenly fragile. Beren's attention was drawn to the first figure directly implicated in the unfolding fallout. On the surface, they maintained composure, attending public events with poise and delivering statements rehearsed to perfection. But behind closed doors, the reality was very different. Whispers of fear, anger, and anticipation spread through inner circles. Strategic discussions, urgent consultations, and subtle maneuvers were undertaken to contain the emerging threat. Beren documented everything, knowing that these moments, invisible to most, would be pivotal in understanding the full scale of the crisis. The leak itself was enigmatic. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, a discrepancy in a timeline, an unexpected arrival noted in a diary, a photograph circulating among a limited group of insiders. It didn't scream scandal, but it contained the seeds of revelation. And once those seeds were recognized, the consequences would grow exponentially. Beren understood this immediately. The palace's control over perception was slipping, and the first public consequences were about to emerge. The initial reactions from the public were modest, almost cautious. Social media chatter, speculative commentary in discreet publications, and the occasional question from journalists began to hint at curiosity, suspicion, and unease. To the palace, this might have seemed trivial, but Beren recognized it as the first wave of a larger tidal force. Once the narrative gained momentum, it would be impossible to contain. And then came the first confrontation. During a routine press briefing, a subtle question exposed the discrepancy that had been quietly building. The official response, polished and precise, attempted to redirect attention, but the damage had already begun. Observers noted the hesitation, the careful phrasing, the slight tremor in tone. For Beren, these were not signs of weakness, they were confirmation. The palace was reacting under pressure, and the public was beginning to notice that all was not as it appeared. Beren also observed the internal dynamics within the palace. Hidden alliances, once stable and protective, began to show strain. Individuals who had previously coordinated with precision now hesitated, second-guessed, and occasionally contradicted one another. The pressure of exposure created fissures, and the first signs of internal conflict became apparent. Even the most disciplined courtiers found themselves navigating a new reality, where secrecy could no longer be guaranteed. Have you ever seen carefully constructed relationships start to fracture under pressure? Beren had front-row seats to that process. Loyalties shifted, trust eroded, and minor disagreements escalated into strategic confrontations. The palace, long a bastion of order and ceremony, was now a theater of tension, uncertainty, and rapidly shifting alliances. And the first public fallout was only the beginning. The stakes escalated further when rumors began to circulate beyond the palace walls. Even controlled leaks, initially dismissed as inconsequential, gained traction as outsiders pieced together fragments of the story. The network of hidden alliances, once operating invisibly, was now under scrutiny. And while the palace attempted to contain the narrative, Beren knew that the story had reached a point of no return. Exposure was inevitable, and the consequences would be profound. In the midst of this unfolding drama, Barron noticed a psychological phenomenon familiar to investigative journalists, but rarely visible to outsiders: panic within power structures. Even the most disciplined individuals exhibited subtle signs of stress, micro-expressions, repeated clarifications, and sudden changes in behavior. These were not mistakes. They were human reactions to the realization that control was slipping. And every reaction, every expression, added another layer to the story Barron was building. The first public fallout had broader implications than anyone anticipated. Questions arose not just about the behavior of individuals, but about the integrity of the institutions themselves. How could the palace maintain authority and credibility if its inner workings were revealed as inconsistent, secretive, and driven by hidden agendas? Barron documented these consequences meticulously, understanding that the narrative of power, once challenged, could alter public perception in irreversible ways. And yet, for all the turmoil, there were moments of dark humor and irony. The very measures taken to preserve control, careful statements, discreet adjustments, and protective maneuvers, often magnified suspicion rather than diminishing it. The palace, in attempting to manage the fallout, inadvertently revealed the fragility of its operations. Barron noted every contradiction, every misstep, and every instance where the attempt to conceal only drew attention to the very secrets they sought to hide. As the fallout intensified, it became clear that the hidden alliances were no longer merely defensive, they were now proactive. Strategic responses were initiated, not just to contain information, but to manipulate perception. Messages were delivered through trusted intermediaries, signals sent to influence behavior, and alliances leveraged to reinforce authority. The palace was fighting back, and Barron had a front-row view of a struggle that combined intelligence, strategy, and human emotion in ways that were both fascinating and dangerous. Have you ever witnessed a system adapt in real time under threat? This was that moment. Every action, every response, and every countermeasure revealed the sophistication, ambition, and determination of those inside the palace. But Barron also recognized that with every defensive move, new vulnerabilities emerged. The very strategies designed to protect secrecy now created additional points of exposure. And then came the first unmistakable proof of public vulnerability. An influential media outlet, armed with fragments of previously private information, began to ask pointed questions. While the palace attempted to maintain composure, the cracks were undeniable. The first scandal, once hidden, had now spilled into the public domain. And with that exposure, the stakes grew exponentially. By the end of this chapter, the palace was facing its first true crisis. The hidden alliances that had previously operated in near-perfect secrecy were now under intense scrutiny. Panic, tension, and strategic maneuvering defined the atmosphere, while the public began to sense that the polished image of stability might be an illusion. Barron's investigation had reached a pivotal point. The private machinations of power were no longer invisible, and the consequences of exposure were beginning to unfold in real time. And then, in the quiet of the evening, a single confidential note arrived for Barron. Its contents were cryptic, yet unmistakable. The palace was aware of his presence, and the next stage of the unfolding crisis would be far more dangerous than anything he had encountered before. What would happen when the palace realized the extent of the exposure? Who would take action first, and what alliances would hold, or break, under pressure? And more importantly, how far would those in power go to protect themselves when the first domino had already fallen? But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. The palace, elegant and formidable, was no stranger to intrigue. But even for centuries-old institutions built on protocol and tradition, the unfolding scandal represented a new kind of threat, one that could not be managed through routine measures, rehearsed statements, or polished appearances. Tom Barron had anticipated the first fallout, but nothing could have prepared him for the covert retaliation that was about to begin. It started subtly. Nothing overt, nothing that would immediately trigger suspicion. Small disruptions, carefully orchestrated, began to surface in Barron's investigation. Access to certain documents was suddenly restricted. Routine communications were delayed, filtered, or redirected. Even couriers and intermediaries who had once operated transparently now acted with caution, uncertainty, and discretion. The palace was mobilizing a response, and it was invisible, precise, and deliberate. Have you ever noticed how systems under threat often become both defensive and aggressive simultaneously? Barron observed this in real time. The palace, recognizing the exposure of its hidden alliances, launched measures designed to destabilize, misdirect, and intimidate. Covert retaliation operates in a way that is almost surgical. It targets the investigator's methods, vulnerabilities, and access points while maintaining plausible deniability. Barron immediately recognized the signs. The first indication came in the form of surveillance anomalies. Meetings that had once been private were subtly observed. Barron noticed unfamiliar faces near his sources, unusual timing in correspondence, and unexpected obstacles in accessing previously routine information. These were not coincidences. They were signals that the palace, and those orchestrating the response, were aware of his investigation and determined to act. Barron, however, thrived under pressure. He understood that retaliation is often as revealing as it is threatening. Every disruption, every obfuscation, every attempt to intimidate offered insight into the inner workings of the palace's defensive network. It was a dangerous dance, one that required patience, intuition, and the ability to anticipate moves several steps ahead. The covert retaliation escalated in phases. Initial measures were subtle, designed to test boundaries and gauge responses. Barron observed blocked access to archives, temporary freezes on key correspondence, and minor personnel shifts, all carefully designed to create the illusion of normalcy while impeding investigative progress. He noted every nuance, every inconsistency, every anomaly. These were not mistakes. They were deliberate, calculated, and strategic. Then came the psychological component. Subtle rumors were seeded among staff and intermediaries, designed to create confusion, mistrust, and hesitation. Barron noticed it immediately. Trusted sources began to question each other. Previously reliable informants became cautious, and the flow of information slowed. The palace's covert retaliation was psychological warfare, aimed not only at controlling access, but at destabilizing the investigation itself. Have you ever seen a system try to manipulate perception while simultaneously concealing its actions? Barron had front-row access. The palace was orchestrating a multi-layered defense, disruption, disinformation, intimidation, and strategic control of visibility. Every move was calculated to maintain the illusion of order while limiting exposure. And every action revealed vulnerabilities and priorities within the palace hierarchy that Barron could exploit to further his investigation. The retaliation reached a critical point when Barron's most reliable source suddenly became unavailable. No explanation was provided, and no communication could be established. Barron immediately suspected palace intervention. It was a clear warning. Interference, whether direct or indirect, was now an active strategy. The palace had recognized his presence, understood the potential consequences of exposure, and was willing to act decisively. Barron also observed patterns in the methods of retaliation. The palace leveraged intermediaries, trusted aides, discreet courtiers, and administrative personnel who could carry out actions without leaving a visible trail. Information was filtered, timelines altered, and movements subtly redirected. The goal was clear: slow, confuse, and destabilize the investigation while maintaining plausible deniability. And it was astonishingly effective. Yet, Barron remained undeterred. He recognized that every measure taken against him provided new insight. Who was involved? What resources were being deployed? Which alliances were activated in response to his investigation? Each act of covert retaliation exposed the internal architecture of the palace's defensive network, allowing him to map relationships, dependencies, and vulnerabilities with increasing precision. Have you ever encountered opposition so subtle and pervasive that it feels almost invisible? That was Barron's reality. Every action, every obstacle, every delay was designed to disorient, yet all of it was traceable for someone who knew what to look for. And Barron knew what to look for. Covert retaliation, he realized, is as much about psychology as logistics. It seeks to manipulate perception, to create doubt, to erode confidence. And in doing so, it often leaves patterns that a careful observer can decode. Then came the first overt sign of escalation, an anonymous warning, delivered through channels too obscure to trace, suggesting that further investigation could carry personal consequences. The message was vague but chilling, an implicit reminder that the palace's reach extended beyond the boundaries of routine operations. Barron understood the gravity of the threat. It was not idle intimidation. It was a signal that those in power were willing to protect their secrets by any means necessary. The response was methodical, almost surgical. Barron noticed that obstacles were placed selectively. Some sources became inaccessible, some archives were suddenly off-limits, and certain key figures disappeared from the public eye without explanation. Every act was deliberate, aimed at isolating, confusing, and testing the limits of the investigation. And yet, each act also confirmed the depth, sophistication, and coordination of the palace's internal networks. Have you ever realized that attempts to obstruct often reveal more than the original information? Barron saw it clearly. The covert retaliation highlighted priorities, vulnerabilities, and alliances. It also exposed the level of fear and urgency within the palace. When secrecy is threatened, institutions often act aggressively, not just to conceal, but to assert dominance, test loyalty, and maintain control. Barron recognized all of these signs, and he used them to further refine his investigation. And then came the most startling discovery yet. A previously unknown intermediary had been orchestrating many of the palace's covert measures. This individual, invisible to public scrutiny, acted as a linchpin in the network, coordinating surveillance, communications, and subtle intimidation tactics. Barron had identified the first truly strategic actor in the retaliation, a master manipulator whose actions had shaped the first wave of obstacles, distractions, and psychological pressure. The revelation was both exhilarating and dangerous. Barron now had evidence not only of the palace's hidden alliances, but of its capacity for covert retaliation. He realized that the next phase of his investigation would require extraordinary caution, creativity, and precision. Every move would be watched, every action interpreted, and every source scrutinized. The palace was no longer a passive subject. It was an active, adaptive, and dangerous opponent. By the end of the chapter, the stakes had escalated dramatically. The first public fallout had already occurred. Hidden alliances were strained under pressure, and covert retaliation had begun in earnest. Barron was navigating a landscape more complex, more perilous, and more revealing than he had anticipated. And he knew that the next breakthrough, when it came, would provoke a response unlike anything the palace had attempted so far. What would happen when Barron uncovered the intermediary orchestrating the retaliation? How far would the palace go to protect its secrets once the investigation pierced the heart of its covert operations? And who would emerge unscathed when the first moves in this dangerous game of power and secrecy collided? But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. The palace, with its centuries of tradition, gilded halls, and ceremonial grandeur, was always an edifice of discipline and order. But beneath the polished surfaces, the hidden alliances that had long governed its internal politics were beginning to fracture. Tom Barron had anticipated tension, but the sudden intensity and scale of the division were beyond even his expectations. The palace, once a fortress of unity, now resembled a battlefield where allegiances shifted in whispers and conspiracies thrived in shadows. It began with subtle signs. Meetings that had previously gone smoothly now ended in terse exchanges, sudden silences, or abrupt departures. Courtiers who had acted as intermediaries between factions became noticeably hesitant, unsure which side to support. Even minor decisions required negotiation, signaling that trust had eroded. Barron noticed these patterns immediately. The palace was no longer a harmonious network of influence, but a fragile, unstable construct teetering on the edge of chaos. Have you ever observed a seemingly solid structure start to crumble from within? That was the spectacle Barron now witnessed daily. Hidden alliances, long maintained through loyalty, fear, and mutual benefit, were showing cracks. The tensions, once controlled and contained, now radiated outward, infecting interactions, decisions, and strategies. The palace, despite its aura of control, was vulnerable in ways that few could have anticipated. Barron's focus shifted to the first major fracture. Two key figures, previously considered pillars of the palace hierarchy, began to operate independently, each pursuing divergent agendas. Their alliance, once reinforced by shared goals and mutual protection, was now strained by competing ambitions, personal grievances, and the pressure of ongoing scrutiny. Small disputes, once inconsequential, escalated into overt conflicts that had ramifications far beyond their immediate circle. The psychological impact was profound. Barron observed that once trusted advisors began to hedge their statements, carefully choosing words to avoid alignment with either faction. Even those who had previously acted with confidence and clarity now exhibited hesitation, overcompensation, and micro-expressions of anxiety. Every gesture, every glance, every pause revealed the shifting power dynamics in real time. Have you ever seen people betray instinct out of fear or self-preservation? Barron recognized that phenomenon constantly unfolding. As the fractures widened, individuals began to prioritize their survival over collective loyalty. Decisions were influenced less by institutional norms than by personal calculus. And in an environment already charged with secrecy and manipulation, these shifts could trigger consequences no one had fully anticipated. The first tangible effect of the fractured alliances emerged during a critical strategic meeting. Long-planned initiatives, meant to preserve the palace's image and authority, were sabotaged subtly. Delays in communication, contradictory instructions, and selective leaks created confusion, forcing the factions to scramble. Barron noted that this was no mere accident. It was the direct result of competing interests, each faction attempting to leverage the instability to its advantage. As tensions escalated, Barron discovered evidence of covert maneuvering designed to strengthen individual positions while weakening opponents. Information, once carefully curated and protected, began to flow selectively to the press, advisors, and external influencers. Courtiers became couriers of influence, manipulating narratives behind the scenes. The palace, already reeling from public fallout, now faced the additional challenge of internal sabotage orchestrated by those meant to uphold its unity.